I'd been here not so long ago, back when the moon base was still under the enemy's control. My bosses back on Earth had sent me to negotiate terms with the Astri, or so I thought. In fact, my diplomatic mission was a lie. A cover story meant to conceal the true nature of the clandestine operation. My companion, a military man called Henderson, was purposefully injected with a virus deadly to the Astri, and his mission was to infect and kill the enemy garrison. But the plan had failed badly, and Henderson was brutally executed. The Astri only spared me so I could deliver their hideous message to the cowardly politicians back on Earth. Never in my wildest dreams had I ever thought I'd return to Europa. Obviously, the circumstances were very different. The base had been captured and secured by friendly forces, and thousands of human prisoners were freed. But still, I felt a grim foreboding as I looked down upon the vast military base, which protruded above the moon's surface. Lisa clearly picked up on my distress as she placed her hand on my shoulder, and she spoke gently into my ear. "How are you holding up, Saul?" she asked. "I'm fine," I replied without much conviction. But my boss wasn't fooled by my thin facade. "I can't imagine what it's like for you to come back here," she said. "But I need your support, Saul. Please know that, and it will be different this time. The Astri aren't running the show anymore. They're finally going to face justice for what they did to our people." I saw her eyes light up as she spoke her next words. "This is a new beginning for all of us. The UN is close to approving Earth's application to join the Galactic Confederation. And before long, we will have to reveal the truth to the people. This isn't a time for fear. It's the time for hope. And once these trials are done, we can all look forward to a peaceful future together." I continued to look into Lisa's dark brown eyes as I feigned a smile. I admired my boss very much. She was highly intelligent and an accomplished diplomat, compassionate, but tough when she needed to be. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake off the unpleasant suspicion that she was naive and unprepared. Lisa Tang had read all the briefings, and she'd experienced the VR reconstructions, but she'd never seen the Astri in the flesh like I had. I feared Lisa didn't truly know our enemy. If she did, she'd realize that the Astri were always dangerous, even when they were locked behind bars. My anxiety only increased as our ship descended down to the moon's surface and docked. Soon, our party left the safe and aesthetically pleasing Confederation starship with its clean, white surfaces and comfortable cabins, and we entered the black and grim interior of the Astri base. The facility was now under Allied control, but there was little they could do about the design and decor. The dark, twisting corridors cutting deep into the moon's core. I couldn't help but recall the horrors I'd been subjected to during my previous ill-fated visit. The psychological tricks the Astri used against us. The thousands of wailing prisoners held in tight cages. The sadistic death fight organized for entertainment. And Henderson's agonizing death at the hands of a hideous alien monster. I was only one of thousands who'd been tortured in this hell-like prison. Except I'd been one of the few lucky enough to survive the ordeal. And as we descended into the bowels of the captured base, my fear turned to anger and a burning desire for revenge. The Astri had to pay for all they'd done. We met our hosts inside a huge chamber located far below the ground, which had once served as the Astri's prison. I recalled the rows of small and confined cages stacked up to the high ceiling, all containing emaciated torture victims, abductees snatched from Earth and subjected to unspeakable atrocities. They were all gone now, of course. Many were surely dead, but I hoped others had won their freedom during the liberation. In any case, the prisoners in cages were gone, leaving only a vast and empty cavern, albeit one filled with the haunting memories of past horrors. The two beings who met us inside were strangers to me, although I was more than familiar with their names and stories. Firstly, there was Gabriel, a member of the Malik race and one of the Confederation's top diplomats. He stood close to 7 foot tall, a slim and pale-skinned humanoid with large, oval-shaped dark eyes. Eyes which shone with intelligence and compassion. Our second host was human, his face weathered and scarred, and his eyes were hard, like they'd seen too much pain and suffering. I'd never met him before, but I had lived a part of his life, seeing and experiencing his bloodiest day. The human was Jamie Wallace, hero of the Europa liberation and invasion of Hades. Here standing before me was perhaps the greatest war hero in human history, but few on Earth had ever heard his name. I wanted to rush forward and shake the man's hand, but instead, I remembered the diplomatic niceties, letting Lisa take the lead as she made the necessary introductions.
"Welcome, my friends,"
Gabriel said in an almost song-like voice.
"I am honored to greet Earth's representatives on this important yet solemn occasion."
"Thank you, Mr. Ambassador," Lisa replied politely.
"And the honor is all ours. May I inquire as to my friend's well-being?"
Gabriel asked.
"I do hope he is readjusting to life on Earth."
"He is indeed," Lisa replied with a sincere smile. "Ambassador Habib is making excellent progress in his talks with the UN representatives. We hope to have a deal signed shortly."
"Excellent,"
Gabriel answered, with a genuine happiness evident in his alien voice. Ambassador Habib was the Confederation's representative on Earth, a human who'd been abducted by the Astri as a child and sold into slavery before he was rescued from a mining colony by Allied forces. Gabriel had taken Habib under his wing, and they'd worked together for decades, apparently forging a close friendship in the process. And Habib was in many ways the perfect man for the role of ambassador to Earth, given his status as a former abductee and his inner knowledge of Confederation politics. Once the formalities were over, Gabriel invited us to proceed to the courtroom.
"The former Admiral's trial will be commencing shortly,"
he explained, as we crossed the cold metal floor of the vast warehouse.
"The prosecution has called multiple witnesses. They are confident of a conviction."
The Astri he referred to was Admiral Taz, a high-ranking commander who'd been captured during the Hades invasion. Before his promotion, he'd commanded the Europa base for many years and had overseen the systematic torture and murder of thousands of human beings. And now he'd been returned here to the scene of the crime to face justice for his many sins. There was something poetic about this trial, although part of me wished Taz was dead already, cast down to hell, where he belonged. I took the opportunity to speak with Jamie as we walked, quietly expressing my admiration for his many achievements. "I watched your combat footage from Hades and have read your file," I began. "I'm sorry if this sounds like a cliché, but I want to thank you for your service. The entire human race owes you and your comrades a great debt." Wallace remained silent for a long time and would not meet my eye. I sensed a deep sadness in the man and worried that I'd said the wrong thing, but the soldier did eventually answer.
"There is no glory in this war, only death and suffering, on a scale you couldn't even imagine."
He sighed deeply before continuing.
"The horrors I've seen, the things I've done, it will all be for nothing, unless the politicians can deliver a lasting peace."
I nodded my head solemnly and said no more. The message was clear and unambiguous. Wallace and his comrades in arms had won the war, with many having paid the ultimate price for that victory. And now it was up to us to forge a brighter future. In that moment, I felt the weight of history on my weary shoulders. There was much work to be done, but first we needed to get through this trial. The court had been converted for this specific purpose. It took the form of an amphitheater, with the judges and observing officials sitting in the stands overlooking the circular area where the defendant was held within an artificially created force field, while the legal teams were set up in a purpose-built platform facing the bench, and the witnesses were brought in and out through a side entrance. I'd visited this amphitheater during my previous mission and knew what the Astri had done here. Gladiatorial games, where human prisoners were forced to fight to the death against alien opponents. Henderson and I were subjected to such a display, forced to watch as 3 young men were slaughtered by an Astri warrior for the purposes of entertainment. I felt queasy to revisit this evil setting and didn't understand why the trial was being held here of all places. Nevertheless, I said nothing, instead taking my place beside Lisa in the viewing gallery, where we were joined by a medley of exotic alien delegates from across the galaxy. We had no official role in the proceedings and were merely here as observers. Still, I noted how the legal process was somewhat different to what we'd see in trials back on Earth. There was a panel of 3 judges who sat above the dock and witness stand. The head judge was a Malak, and to his right was a member of the Lycan race, a gray-haired wolfman with fierce and intimidating eyes. The 3rd and final panel member was a calmer, except he was not here in person. The large squid-like alien with flaying tentacles and saucer-sized eyes was projected into the courtroom and took the form of a 3-dimensional hologram. There were logistical reasons for the alien not appearing in the flesh, but I recalled how the Kalmar were notoriously xenophobic, and their judge perhaps didn't wish to mix with so many alien species. Nevertheless, the panel of 3 would deliver both the verdict and sentence in this trial, because there was no jury in attendance. I was surprised to see that the prosecutor was a human being, although only recognizable as one, due to the various modifications made to his physical body. He introduced himself as Elijah, without providing a surname, and proceeded to deliver a passionate opening statement in which he outlined the substantial case against Admiral Taz, including charges of mass kidnapping, slavery, murder, and genocide. It was certainly a compelling case, and it was difficult to imagine what defense the Astri commander could offer, other than to cite the brutal and violent nature of his species. The defense lawyer was, in fact, an AI drone which hovered over the courtroom floor. The Astri refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, and no Confederation lawyer wanted to represent these monsters. And so, a robotic advocate was the only other option. And then there was the defendant himself. Admiral Taz stood behind a transparent force field, flanked by a duo of armed guards. 2 fierce-looking Lycans, armed with laser pistols and sabers. The Astri prisoner still frightened me, in spite of his situation. I watched carefully as his intelligent, predatory eyes scanned the courtroom, sizing up the security and attendees. I dreaded to think what was going through his twisted mind, but I feared the Astri had a devious plan yet to be revealed. What promised to be a long trial commenced with the calling of the first witness. The young man who was ushered into the court looked terrified, visibly shaking, as he crept past the snarling Admiral Taz and took his place on the witness stand. His face was a ghostly shade of pale, and his eyes watery as he gave his name and answered preliminary questions from the prosecutor. Thankfully, the nervous witness didn't need to provide a verbal statement or be cross-examined. The Confederation's neural technology allowed us to view a visual representation of his memories, which were projected onto a screen on the far side of the amphitheater. I felt a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach as I watched a depressingly familiar tragedy play out. It started with the victim walking through a forest at night, suddenly surprised by a blaring siren and a blinding light emanating from above the treetops. The man tried to run, breathing heavily as he dashed deeper into the forest, but the tractor beam got him, and suddenly his body was lifted from the ground and pulled upwards. He kicked and screamed, but all his efforts were futile as he was sucked into the light, and then the screen went black as the witness presumably lost consciousness. The next relived memory showed the witness naked and exposed in a tight cage, with all his dignity stripped away. He was held in a row of similar cages, with fellow prisoners on each side of him, all emaciated and many bearing the obvious signs of torture, with deep scars evident on their naked skin. I noted how many sat in their own filth. Several were crying, and some appeared to have lost any semblance of sanity, rocking back and forth and muttering to themselves incoherently. The wailing of the prisoners increased in volume when an Astri drone proceeded down the line, dispassionately observing the caged humans with its inbuilt cameras. The robot stopped beside the witness's cage, homing in on him while deploying its weapons. The man screamed as he recoiled in terror, but there was no escape from the tight cage. And then the drone fired a taser-like weapon, knocking the man out, and once again turning the screen black. The third memory apparently took place after the witness regained consciousness. He was down on his knees in a dark room, the floor below him sticky with what was surely dried blood. The man whimpered in terror until the light suddenly switched on. A row of shaking prisoners were lined up, their heads down and hands bound behind their backs. And suddenly, a ferocious Astri emerged, walking along the line and looking down upon his prisoners with utter contempt. I looked closer and realized that the reptilian was none other than Admiral Taz. The cold look in his yellow, predatory eyes was unmistakable. I took a deep breath as we watched the atrocity play out in the witness's eyes. Taz carried a long and sharp saber in his right claw, suddenly stabbing out and impaling the first prisoner with the sword, rapidly withdrawing the blade before the prisoner fell heavily and bled out on the cold metal floor. Taz quickly moved on to the next prisoner, slashing out with the sword and exerting a great force, which cut the man's head clean off. The severed head rolled along the ground and came to rest just inches in front of the witness. He looked away in disgust, shaking and crying under his breath as he waited for the Astri to reach him. The Admiral snarled, and the witness looked up, seeing the open maw of the reptilian with his razor-sharp fangs exposed. The beast's pupils dilated, and there was no hint of compassion or mercy behind them. He raised his sword, and it seemed certain that he would kill the witness, but at the last moment he stopped, laughing cruelly before smacking the human with the back of his claw, knocking him down and returning the screen to darkness. This marked the end of the first witness's evidence. Shocked gasps and outraged muttering broke out amongst the public gallery from both human and alien observers alike. I myself was sickened and enraged, but also hopeful. Admiral Taz had almost certainly spared the life of the witness that day, so he could continue to torture him in the future. But he'd made a critical error. We'd all just seen the Admiral brutally murder 2 innocent humans with his own hands. This evidence was damning, and there were many more witnesses still to come. But, as it turned out, Admiral Taz clearly had no intention of awaiting the verdict. The first witness was still on the stand when suddenly all the lights went out, plunging the courtroom into complete darkness. There were panicked shouts and at least one scream in the 10 seconds, which followed before the emergency lights came on. I heard a crashing sound, followed by another and another. Turning around, I saw how the AI security drones were dropping out of the air, with their power source apparently disconnected. I also noted how the holographic image of the calmer judge had disappeared, which I found highly suspicious. But worst of all, the field around the accused was no longer active. One would have expected Admiral Taz to make a break for freedom, but instead, he stood perfectly still and showed no emotion as the two Lycan guards held him at gunpoint. I looked into Lisa's dark brown eyes in that moment, seeing her previous hope and energy replaced by shock and terror. And then we all heard the first explosion, a mighty boom which shook the courtroom and resulted in a mass panic as observers and legal staff ran for the exits. But few made it out alive. There was another explosion, much louder and closer this time. I turned my head to see the far wall of the amphitheater collapsing and a small army charging through the gap. The war machines came fast, a dozen killer drones of Astri design, all heavily armed and armored. I knew what was coming and instinctively dove to the floor, dragging Lisa down with me. This action surely saved both of our lives. As a second later, the drones fired indiscriminately with high-velocity rounds and laser cannons. We heard the deafening din of gunfire and terrified screams as bloody chaos ensued inside of the courtroom. Within minutes, dozens of delegates and observers were cut down in a heinous massacre, with the prosecutor, first witness, and two remaining judges all dying in quick succession. I fearfully looked down to where the Admiral stood, now freed from his force field prison. One of the guards was down, while the second Lycan was distracted, firing upwards at the drones descending upon him. Taz took his opportunity, grabbing a saber from the dead guard and plunging it into the Lycan's back. The wolfman howled in agony before collapsing to the blood-stained floor, and now the prisoner was free. A moment later, and two juvenile Astri warriors burst through the hole in the wall, firing wildly as they came. They immediately went to the side of the Admiral, forming a protective circle around him. I remembered from the briefing that Taz had two sons, and now it seemed they'd come to rescue their father. But how had this attack been possible? How had they gotten here and evaded our defenses? The answer seemed clear to me. It was the Kalmar. The bastards had double-crossed us, but there would be time for recriminations later if we survived. I took advantage of a temporary lull in the fighting as the Astri invaders secured their perimeter. Grabbing Lisa firmly by the hand, I whispered in her ear, saying, "We need to get out. They will kill us." Lisa nodded her head in agreement, and we moved, staying low as we rushed for the exit. Somehow, we made it out into the corridor as the gunfire started up behind us. We ran halfway down before getting caught in the crossfire as a Confederation security squad fired from one end and the trio of Astri attacked from our rear. I thought quickly, seeing a door on our right-hand side and screaming, "Quick! In here!" We darted inside, barely avoiding the bullets and laser beams, but we were far from safe. "What the hell is this place?" Lisa asked fearfully. I scanned the room, and my blood froze when I saw the pair of metal gurneys in the center of the room, and the various sharp and nasty implements held on a rack in the corner. We'd unwittingly taken refuge inside of an Astri torture chamber. But it got worse. A moment later, and the three Astri burst inside, snarling with fury once they saw us. The first son held us at gunpoint, while his brother shot out the door's mechanism, trapping us all inside. Meanwhile, the Admiral glared at us with a murderous glint in his reptilian eyes, and I knew we were in serious trouble. The two juveniles darted forward, seizing both Lisa and I with their claws. We kicked and screamed, but could not escape, as our bodies were slammed down against the cold gurneys. and our arms and legs were strapped in securely. I heard Lisa sobbing softly, but there was nothing I could do to help my boss, because I was tied down too, staring up at the ceiling as my whole body shook. The Astri had me in their ice-cold grasp again, and I didn't expect to be spared for a second time. Our captors left us alone for a time as they fought amongst each other. We could hear a flurry of activity on the other side of the sealed door, and it seemed like Confederation forces had regained control of the corridor. Admiral Taz snarled and growled, his tongue and claws clicking aggressively as he remonstrated with his sons. At one point, he lashed out, striking his younger child and beating him mercilessly whilst he was on the floor. Clearly, the rescue operation hadn't gone to plan. The assault force had successfully liberated the Admiral from the courtroom, but their escape plan must have gone south, as now they were cornered and trapped. I thought the situation might work to our advantage. If our captors needed us as hostages, they would surely have to keep us alive. But sadly, the Astri don't think this way. Once the Admiral had finished beating his youngest son, he turned his attention towards us. My blood froze once I saw the pure hatred burning in his murderous eyes. The Astri Admiral had endured the humiliation of capture and imprisonment, and now he was filled with rage, ready to take vicious revenge upon us, his helpless and bound prisoners. I watched him looking down upon us as he considered who he would torture first. I fought against my restraints, but to no avail, and Taz grinned sadistically at me, showing his fangs, before he moved on, his claws clicking on the metal floor as he approached Lisa's gurney. "No," I screamed. "Leave her alone, you sick bastard." But he would not stop. Taz had a selection of torture implements to choose from, but he went old school, using his own sharp claws to inflict extreme pain. I heard Lisa pleading for mercy just before he cut into her flesh, and then she started to scream bloody murder. The long minutes which followed were the worst of my life, as I struggled in vain and shouted Lisa's name, squirming every time I heard the sickening sound of her flesh and bones being cut and her blood spraying in all directions. Gradually, Lisa's screams grew fainter as her strength faltered, and then she was silent. Tears were rolling down my cheeks, and my heart was broken, but Taz simply laughed cruelly, taking a moment to admire his own grisly handiwork before he turned his attentions toward me. The butcher stood over me with Lisa's blood still dripping from his claws as he prepared to cut. I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst, but salvation came at the last possible moment. I heard a soft popping sound, opening my eyes and looking over Taz's shoulder, seeing the cover of an air vent shoot open and a small drone fly through the gap. The drone opened fire, shooting and killing the eldest son in a lightning attack. Next, the robot turned on Taz, but the Admiral acted quickly, raising his laser pistol and shooting the drone out of the air. But a moment later, there was an explosion, which knocked Taz off balance and filled the room with a choking smoke. The door was blown open, and armed troops charged through. Taz recovered and raised his gun to fire, but he was too slow on this occasion. I saw Jimmy Wallace run into the torture chamber, firing as he came. His first round hit Taz square in his chest, throwing him backwards. The Astri fell heavily to the metal floor, squirming in agony from the bullet wound in his torso. But Wallace acted quickly, firing a second shot through the Admiral's head and ending his life once and for all. The younger son was the last Astri standing, but, to my surprise, he threw down his gun and raised his claws to surrender. More troops entered the room, securing the prisoner and releasing me from my restraints. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt sick to my stomach as I glanced across at Lisa's mutilated corpse and realized she was beyond help. Once again, I had survived, but Ambassador Tang had paid the ultimate price, becoming yet another victim of a war that should be done and dusted. The tears continued to roll down my cheeks as they wheeled her body out of the room, and I cursed the dead Admiral Taz, whose corpse lay on the floor, believing that he'd gotten off far too easily. I was eventually escorted to the sickbay, where a medical drone examined me and prescribed a sedative for the shock. I continued to sit in the white room, struggling to come to terms with the savagery of what I'd just witnessed. I didn't want to speak with anyone in that moment, not even Wallace, who had saved my life. But in the end, it was Gabriel, the Malak diplomat, who came to speak with me. And the alien knew just what to say.
I'm told you have suffered no serious injuries,
he began in a cool and emotionless tone. Yeah, I replied sharply, whilst avoiding the Malak's oval eyes. I wanted him to leave me alone, but Gabriel persevered regardless.
You grieve for your fallen colleague?
He asked. Of course I do, I shot back angrily. That monster butchered her, and there was nothing I could do. Lisa deserved so much better. That last sentence hung in the air for a long moment. Gabriel didn't speak, but I sensed he was waiting for me to elaborate. I looked into his large, dark eyes, whilst I did so, feeling that I could speak freely. Ambassador Tang was a great woman, I eventually muttered. I used to think she was naive, but now I see how brave she was. Lisa wanted more than anything else to bring Earth into the Confederation and help build a lasting peace in our galaxy. That was the noble mission she was prepared to die for. Gabriel nodded in understanding before he replied.
Well, then it is your duty to continue her good work. You must ensure your colleague did not die in vain.
And of course, he was right. I'm telling you this story to honor Ambassador Tang's legacy, and I will dedicate the rest of my life to fulfilling her mission. Like I said, times are changing. The governments of Earth cannot hide the truth any longer. One day soon, the Malak and the other races of the Confederation will make themselves known to the global population, and we will take our place in the galactic community. The Astri have suffered a catastrophic defeat, but there are other threats out in the galaxy, not least from the treacherous Kalma. We may be a long way from a permanent settlement, but together we are strong and will surely prevail. Peace be with you, my friends. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more descent into the unknown content.